Hi guys, Neil Willman from the New Zealand Cheese School here again. Today I'm talking about problems with blue cheese or inadequate veining of the cheese. But firstly, before we start that topic, let's just think about how mold actually grows inside the cheese or on the outside of the cheese. Of course, we use the blue mold spores of Penicillium roqueforti, which turn various shades of blue or green. And they will grow inside the cheese, providing they have oxygen and a gap and a space to do it. That's why we call it a vein. Those little gaps are called veins. And if we have the right amount of mold grow throughout the cheese, we get a lovely, attractive blue vein cheese. But the process does require some care and attention during manufacture. So oxygen is important for mold to grow. So the inadequate growth of the mold, it could be that the cheese itself, when you've made the cheese in the vat, is not dry enough, and when it goes into the mold or the hoop, it's too soft at that point. And soft curd will collapse, and those veins or openings and provide inadequate veining of the cheese. So the curd needs to be dry enough at that point. I can talk about pressing or overpressing, but it's not really pressing per se. Not turning the cheese enough once it's going into the hoop can mean that the weight of the cheese on the top half of the hoop is all pressing the cheese on the bottom half of the hoop. And the cheese in the bottom half of the hoop is getting excessively pressed and closing up whilst the top part is being unpressed. So you'll end up getting one-sided blue veining in that particular case. So to avoid that, we need to regularly turn during that early draining. When the whey is draining out, it needs to be regularly turned to get even openings and veinings and preventing that one-sided blue defect. It's also important that the curd is in particles, small particles, when going into the hoop. It can't be knitted in clumps, otherwise we've already got a lack of openings in those larger clumps. So we put small particles, individual particles, into the hoop. It's important that the curd going into the hoop as well is not too warm. Warm curd likes to fuse together, and that will cause closing of openings. Cold curd, on the other hand, doesn't really fuse together that well. So keep the curd probably somewhere around 30 degrees or in that ballpark, maybe up to 32, to avoid the curd fusing together. High temperatures will end up defeating the purpose of making the blue. High salt levels are another potential problem. If the salt levels in the cheese are too high or on the surface are too high, then some strains of the mold won't grow so well. The mold strains that we're talking about, each strain has a different salt sensitivity. So therefore, we need to understand that some strains will be okay at higher salt levels than others, and others not. So understand the characteristics of your blue vein Penicillium spores before you start. The biggest cause, however, of lack of blue veining is not piercing the cheese afterwards. Those veins which occur in the cheese do need a constant supply of oxygen, because the mold, when they start to grow in those veins, consume the oxygen and produce carbon dioxide as a consequence of that. Now, too much CO2 and not enough oxygen causes the mold to start to die, and you won't get enough oxygen in that aperture. But if you spike the cheese, and that needs to be done when the mold is starting to grow, somewhere around about a week to 10 days, the mold will get enough oxygen to be able to continue to grow. It may be that the cheese needs more spiking than normal. If the cheese is a little bit soft, more spiking gives more holes, and therefore you'll have more, not veins so much, but blue in individual spiking apertures. So inadequate piercing is the biggest single cause of not enough veining. Now, the piercing can go from the top or from the side. It's a little bit academic, but from a technological point of view, it's better from the side. It's because carbon dioxide, which is produced by the mold and needs to get out, is heavier than air. So it's not going to rise up out of the cheese and come out the holes at the top very well. It will diffuse out through the sides of the cheese naturally, but if you have the holes going from the sides, then it will actually pass out better and give you more appropriate veining. The only other comment I'll make is that sometimes you may want blue vein on the surface of the cheese. And if you don't have enough humidity in the maturing room, then the air's too dry and the surface of the cheese become too dry and you'll get inadequate mold on the surface. That's a bit of a moot point because for many blue cheese makers, they don't want much mold on the surface anyway. So, yeah, take your pick. Cheers. Hope you enjoyed.